Hi, once again, we are going to go back and talk about the 5 principles of the Constitution. Why has our Constitution lasted longer than any other free world's document? We've talked about popular sovereignty, which is the idea that our Constitution is based on we the people. We had a discussion of how the concept of who the people are has changed throughout history. It's become more inclusive. We also have talked extensively about federalism, the powers that are shared between the state and federal government, and how this is a wonderful dance that kind of works between the two. If it's within the state, it is a state power. If it seems to cross state lines, then it becomes a national power. We've also talked about limited government, that we have a government that is not all powerful, and that we have limitations set up in the Bill of Rights. Things like habeas corpus, which means that you have to be charged. They can't just keep you in jail. And that the government is restricted on what it can take away from our individual freedoms and liberties. We ended kind of in the middle of separation of powers, which is the 3 branches of government. And we were talking about expressed, implied, and inherent powers. And I know that inside that particular set of notes that you had no place to place this. Of course, it's just kind of indicated that you will write them. I think there's some room on the back. And so please get those written in. If you did not get these notes on the last one, you'll need to go to the other video on limited government. Okay. We talked about the powers that are denied the national and the state governments, things that they cannot do. And so now what we want to do is we want to talk about the concept of separation of powers, which is the 4th principle of why government has lasted so long. Separation of powers is this concept. The president is one powerful guy. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't remember what that link was. So separation of powers is the idea that each branch of government has its own set of delegated or assigned powers. Delegated, remember, could be called expressed powers. Basically, as this says, this is their job description. This is what each branch is expected to do. So let's start with the legislative branch. The legislative branch's job is basically to make laws, coin money, and declare war. You'll see that there's a little star there by make laws, because that is the primary function of the legislative branch. Well, if we look at the state governments, they too have to make laws, regulate education, voting regulations, and licensing. This is an example of federalism. At the national level, they have powers that they are responsible for, and at the state level. So separation of powers goes hand in hand with federalism. So let's go on to the next branch of government, which is the executive branch. The executive branch, which is headed by the president, as seen here with the White House, their job is to enforce the laws. And I notice I don't have that starred, so please star that. And they have the appointment power, which of course we're seeing our president do at this time, and meet with foreign leaders, which presidents do almost on a weekly basis. If we go to the executive branch at the state level, which of course is headed by our governor, pretty much the same thing. Enforce the laws, prepare a state budget and suggestions for the legislative branch, and again, run the enforcement arm of the state laws. The 3rd branch of government is the judicial branch, which is headed by the Supreme Court. Their job is primarily to interpret the laws. Please star that one. It is their responsibility to declare laws unconstitutional. Remember, Article 6 says that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. And because it is the supreme law of the land, nothing can come in contradiction to it. Therefore, if something does, that law would be declared unconstitutional. At the state level, the state Supreme Courts declare state laws unconstitutional. So as long as the Iowa's Constitution is in how do you want to put it, is in compliance or in line with the federal government's constitution, we can, it does not have to be the same, it just cannot violate the Constitution. Separation of powers is a tremendous response, is a tremendous power that it has. And in class, we will go through each of these and play this game. Okay. Principle 5 is the idea of checks and balances. In other words, checks and balances and separation of power go hand in hand because each one has a job description, but in their job description, it might be where they have to watch over somebody else, okay, or check it. So here's a couple of examples, okay. At the legislative branch, let's say they pass a law. Well, the executive branch has to enforce it, but if the executive branch does not like the law, the president can veto it. And the legislative branch, if they don't like the veto, can override it with a 2/3 vote. The president makes judicial appointments to the courts, but he relies on the legislative branch, specifically the Senate, to approve those appointments. So even though each of these have their own responsibility, the president makes the appointment to the judicial branch, but needs to have the legislative branch approve it. All of that is a check on or a watch over the other one. This has a lot to do with the game that we played in class called power grab, making sure that one branch does not become more powerful than the other. Okay? Let's look at another example. How does the judicial branch check the other branches? Well, one is the judicial branch can declare laws passed by Congress unconstitutional. So if Congress passes a law that does violate the U.S. Constitution, the judicial branch would step in and declare it unconstitutional. Remember, however, that it has to come through the court system. There are lots of laws out there that are unconstitutional, but people don't challenge them either because they can't or it's not a big enough deal. The judicial branch can also take those orders of the executive, similar to what we just saw President Trump do, and declare those unconstitutional. Again, someone has to take it to court in order for it to happen. They're not sitting there going, you can't do that. It only has to have to be somebody feels their rights have been violated. Let's look at another example. How does the president check on the legislative branch? Well, first of all, as we said, it is the executive branch's responsibility to enforce the laws passed by Congress. If Congress passes a law and the president does not want to enforce them, then that is a check on that branch. Now, it is inherently the president's responsibility to enforce the laws passed by Congress, whether he agrees or not. But there have been many incidences where the president has not put his full force into a particular law, and therefore it doesn't get enforced as much as it should. The president appoints judges to the judicial branch, and remember that the legislative branch must approve them. So, the 5 principles of the Constitution: popular sovereignty, federalism, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and a checks and balance is judicial review, sometimes seen as a 6th principle. You combine that with the chance that we do have the opportunity to change our Constitution through the amendment process. And most of the Constitution is written in a very gray and vague writing, meaning they left it open to interpretation. They did not get as specific as they could have. And they had the elastic clause, which we'll talk about in class. The elastic clause allows for the necessary and proper clause, things necessary and proper to expand. You put all of these things together, and that is why our Constitution has lasted as long as it has.